Part 1. Styles of Suffering. Chapter 2. I obsess about what hurts the most. Thought loops and rumination. Have you ever noticed how much time you spend thinking about what went wrong, is wrong, and will go wrong? If the answer is a lot, you're normal, even if it doesn't feel normal or good. According to a study by the National Science Foundation, humans experience as many as 60,000 thoughts per day. Deepak Chopra, MD, sets the number even higher, between 60 and 80,000 thoughts per day. Furthermore, according to current research, 80% of those thoughts are negative, and 90% are redundant. That is, they tell us the same things over and over again. Oddly, the more negative a thought, the more we're inclined to engage with it and return to it. If you do the math, that's a lot of negative and repetitive thoughts. When a thought appears, we instantly are off on the ride it offers, or threatens. We view its invitation as a mandate and jump on board without consideration, no matter where it's headed. Indeed, thinking can take us on some dangerous rides and into some dark and dreadful neighborhoods inside our own mind. Pamela wakes up every morning inside what she calls a hornet's nest. Before her head is off the pillow, she's deluged with swirling thoughts like venomous wasps, an unending stream of problems to solve, things that might go wrong, and tasks to be completed. She starts her day flooded with anxiety, dread, and a sense of overwhelm, before her feet even hit the floor. It's like being engulfed in a swarm of bees, thoughts buzzing all around and inside me. It's as if our mind wakes up with all the stored-up energy it didn't get to release for 8 hours. It returns to consciousness by aggressively producing thoughts and reestablishing its place as commander-in-chief. The evolutionary function of negative thoughts. At an evolutionary level, we focus on the negative as a survival instinct. As psychologist Dr. Rick Hanson explains, we have a negativity bias when it comes to our attention. Negative information creates more activity in the brain, more firings than positive information of equal intensity. Our brains are also better at noticing the negative than they are at noticing the positive. In an effort to protect us, our brains exaggerate threats, undervalue our abilities and strengths, and obscure our capacity to deal with difficulty. We're Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for good experiences, says Hanson, which means we think about, remember, and deem important whatever goes wrong or is bad in our life. And at the same time, we tend to forget, discount, or minimize what's good. What's certain is that we have a harder time unsticking from negative thoughts once they've got their glue on us. Bad glue is stickier than good glue. Compounding the problem is the fact that negative experiences take up more space in our brains than positive experiences. Dr. John Gottman, a relationship researcher, discovered that for each negative interaction that takes place between a couple, it takes 5 positive interactions to bring that couple back to a state of contentment. In terms of importance, it's a 5-to-1 ratio, positive to negative, an uneven fight indeed. For millions of years, living creatures have had to decide whether to focus on either getting the things they want or avoiding the things that could hurt them. What Hanson calls chasing carrots or ducking sticks. When it comes to avoiding extinction, ducking the stick may be a better strategy. After all, if we miss the carrot today, we can probably find one tomorrow. But if we fail to duck the stick today, there won't be a tomorrow. Evolutionarily, it's wiser, then, to keep our attention vigilantly attuned and scanning for those elements that could potentially wipe us out of existence. Modern dangers are different. Our understanding of what constitutes danger, the stick, has changed since the time of jellyfish. In modern times, the threat of dying in the forest at the stroke of a stick has been, for the most part, eliminated. With 412 varieties of cereal to choose from at our local grocery store, the drive to survive biologically has been replaced by a drive to survive psychologically. It's the psychological death from which we seek to protect ourselves now. Our minds are working around the clock to keep our self-worth, our ego, from being injured or annihilated. With the real-life carrots and sticks gone, the potential threats shift to our identity, the story we tell ourselves about who we are. We're always scanning and strategizing to ensure that no situation damages our value or self-esteem. While I'm sure there were many sticks to avoid when we survived in the forest, in modern times, the potential threats to our ego are infinite. As a result, hypervigilance seems to be mandatory when it comes to keeping ourselves psychologically and emotionally intact. At the most basic level, we return to our negative thoughts because we're trying to turn a negative experience into something more positive, essentially to make it come out a different way. Our mental replays are attempts to re-script an experience we don't want into something we want, to reestablish our self-worth and emotional balance. If we could just understand our negative situation better, know our problem more clearly, spend more time with it, eventually we'd be able to make it disappear, or at least feel better. We hold tight to our pain so we can figure out how to make it go away. We believe an answer exists inside every negative situation, and if we could unearth it through thinking, it would free us from pain. A painful paradox to self-care. Clinging to suffering, paradoxically, is a way of trying to take care of ourselves. We're convinced that the kernel of resolution will appear from somewhere inside the rubble of the problem. But usually, the only thing that appears is more suffering. We're left stuck in the rubble, scavenging for that unfindable gem of relief. So, too, continually thinking about what hurts makes us feel that our pain matters, that it didn't happen for no reason, and that it won't be forgotten. We refuse to steer our attention away from what hurts because doing so feels like abandoning our pain, and thus abandoning ourselves. We stay with our suffering to keep our suffering company. As a client, Morgan expressed, "It's so painful to turn away from what hurts, even more painful than it is to think about or feel it." When we think about leaving our pain behind, a great sadness can arise, as if we're making the choice to ignore our wounds, to turn a deaf ear to their truth, our truth. To stop engaging with thoughts seems to say that our pain doesn't matter, or, maybe worse, is not real. Our ruminations provide our suffering with empathy, which so often it doesn't receive from those we most want it from, those we think have created our pain or should care. To stop revisiting our hurt can feel like we're moving on before the hurt has been properly heard, validated, or soothed. In this way, our attention, in the form of thinking, can feel like a salve to our wounds. I had known Sharon for many years before she lost her child in a car accident. For the decade that followed, she talked about her child every time we met, and about how she couldn't live without her daughter here on the planet. Her pain had been excruciating since the accident, understandably. At one point I asked her, with the deepest compassion, who she would be if this were not at the center of every moment of her life. She told me that she didn't want to be anyone else. She didn't want to move on. If she didn't think about her daughter, Her daughter wouldn't exist, and she couldn't allow that, would never survive that. She told me without question she would rather suffer every moment for the rest of her life as opposed to move on from this. For Sharon, it couldn't be over. She wouldn't let it be over. Ever. You might hold on to your suffering because you're not ready for the past to be past. You may not feel ready to let go of what the pain contains, and also not ready to let go of the hope that your past could become a better past. We return to our painful thoughts and memories as a way of coming home to ourselves, returning to a core self-experience. Pain can feel deeply familiar. It may be how we felt in our families growing up. Pain, in its own way, can be comforting. It's what we know, a state of being that feels like home. As a felt experience, pain has a weight and depth that is grounding, calming even, as opposed to happiness, which can feel light, ephemeral, and untethered, without roots. For many people, pain can actually feel safer than happiness. While we can acknowledge that focusing on our pain may have a self-caring intention, nonetheless, we must also acknowledge that, in practice, it does not take care of us. You need to give proper attention to your wounds. No one can skip this step. But you also must recognize when you've acknowledged and felt your hurt enough, spent enough time honoring it. You don't have to live in or from your pain in order to know it or take care of it. Pain will present itself when it needs to. It will arise organically when you're in it. But you're not obligated to bring pain into this now, when it's not naturally here. You don't need to wallpaper the present moment with suffering in order to prove that it matters. Exercise. Is thinking helping or hurting? This practice can help you discern when your devotion to your pain, when keeping company with your suffering, is no longer helpful or self-loving, and when you compulsively and habitually scratch at your wounds. All of us have to decide when enough is enough. 1. The next time you're caught in a painful memory or thought loop, stop for a moment and place one hand on your heart. Feel the kindness in this simple gesture of inviting your own heart into the space. Take a deep breath. 2. Ask yourself, with curiosity, not judgment, have I sufficiently acknowledged the suffering that this particular situation has caused me? If not, take a few moments and offer yourself that acknowledgement, that compassion. Remind yourself that this matters. Say it out loud. 3. Then ask yourself whether going over this situation again, retelling this story, revisiting what hurts, rehearsing the case against whomever harmed you, is actually easing your suffering. Is it coming up with a solution? Is it changing what happened? Is it making you feel better? If it is, then by all means continue. But if it isn't, then give yourself permission to stop. While turning away from your painful thoughts can feel counterintuitive, unloving, and even re-traumatizing, in fact, more often than not, it's the very thing you need to do to feel better. So take genuine care of yourself and do this practice. Take this moment and give yourself a chance at contentment. At first, it can feel like you have to gather up all your strength, brace yourself, and rip your attention away from painful thoughts, like a bandage off a deep cut. But every time you shift your attention in this conscious way, every time you decline pain's invitation and refuse to engage with painful thoughts, you're doing 3 important things. loosening your attachment to negativity and suffering, building the muscle that you use to direct your own attention, cultivating a sense of self that's separate from your thoughts, a place from which you can be with your thoughts, in a relationship with thoughts, but without being identified or merged with them. It is the idea of what it means to leave your pain behind that hurts, your thoughts about leaving your thoughts, not the actual leaving, and certainly not what's left when they're gone. Despite the rumors, our mind may proliferate. When we peel our attention away from what hurts, we don't feel abandoned, uncared for, or invalidated. All the things we feared would happen. Our negative thoughts are not missed. As it turns out, if we don't hold on to our pain doesn't hold on to us. Suffering is left behind, but not in the way we imagine, not like an abandoned dog on the side of the road. To dismiss thoughts of pain is not to dismiss pain. Whatever you've lived, every experience and emotion has become a part of you, integrated into the fabric of who you are now. The you who turns away from the painful thoughts and turns back to the present moment already contains the experiences you're trying so hard to hold on to. You don't need to constantly remind yourself of the pain to keep it. The pain won't suffer when you stop rigorously attending to it. It isn't waiting on the side of the road for you to come back and get it. When we're not engaging with our painful thoughts, life can positively surprise us. We're more present and open to new experiences. The relief we've been longing for is right here under our nose. As one friend described, "Who knew I could choose to say no to the pain and yes to the present moment? That something so direct and simple would be the solution." We tend to spend our whole lives looking for a way to fix the past, so we can have permission to enter the present, only to find out that we didn't need permission at all. The whole paradoxical catastrophe is tragically ridiculous. Wounds can become who we think we are. No discussion of our attachment to pain would be complete without a mention of pain as a part of our identity. Pain is profoundly intertwined with our sense of who we are. What we've endured, overcome, and survived, our struggles, challenges, sorrows, and losses, our scars, make us us. Our difficulties do become a part of us. They change us. Our suffering is integrated into our nervous systems, hearts, and brains. And yet negative experiences take up a disproportionate amount of space in our sense of who we are. We're deeply attached to our stories of suffering. We love our pain and take pride, strength, and solace in what we've suffered. Our pain defines us. It's the meat of our self. We habitually think about our pain as a way of experiencing ourselves. Ending your love affair with your pain, therefore, can feel like you're giving up who you fundamentally are. Ask yourself, what am I afraid of if I stopped reminding myself of my pain, of what I've survived? Who would I be without my suffering? If it feels right, you might also want to journal, preferably with pen and paper, not on a screen, with this exercise. Jim's mother was, in his words, critical and unsupportive, totally unable to celebrate me or my talents. As Jim experienced it, she was never proud of him and never enjoyed anything about him. As an adult, he frequently thought and talked about the absence of a proud mother in his life. Over time, Jim had built a strong narrative of himself, one that he spent much time ruminating over, and used to explain whatever wasn't working in his life. He thought of himself and related to others as the guy who'd been unsupported and uncelebrated, who could have been so much more, who could have realized his great potential, had he been encouraged. Jim had locked himself into the role of someone who didn't get what he needed and deserved. Noticing how much time Jim spent thinking about his mother and what he had lost out on, I asked him, "What would you have to give up if you released that whole story, resigned from your role of that guy, if you stopped thinking that past experience with your mother back into the present moment?" His answer, after a moment of reflection, was insightful and pointed. "Who would I be if I weren't the guy who wasn't enjoyed by his own mother? And maybe worse, what would I have to do if I was responsible for fulfilling my own potential?" Well, he said this with a smile. We both understood the dire truth in his hypothetical questions. Exercise. Who am I now? For a single conversation, or even a whole day, try showing up for life as someone with no history, no narrative. Notice what it's like to live without a story, without a preconceived idea of who you are and what's happened to you. Drop before now and let there be only now. Notice who you are, or become, in the absence of a self-story. Notice how it feels to be free of your story on you. It turns out, when we stop continuously reminding ourselves of who and how we are, often we are surprised by what we discover. Who we are turns out to be not who we think we are, and who we keep telling ourselves we are. Without the heavy coat of a predetermined self, the present moment appears light, naked, alive, and ripe with potential. At last we can meet what's here without our story of self in the way. Keeping busy by chewing on mental junk food. Perhaps most importantly, we feel drawn to difficulty because it gives our mind something to do. A problem is an activity, a task, a free pass to kick up as many thoughts as possible, all in a valiant effort to help us find a solution. Giving the mind a problem is like giving a dog a bone. The mind gets to analyze it, contemplate it, play with it, make pro and con lists about it, talk about it, and, for as long as we'll let it, which is usually pretty long, chew on it. As far as the mind is concerned, there's nothing as fun and empowering as a big, juicy problem. If the mind celebrated Christmas, it would ask Santa to bring it a sleigh full of problems, every day. When things are going well in our life, however, there's not much for the mind to do or solve. We can think about what's going well, and maybe even think about how grateful we are for it. But there's not much else for the mind to do with happiness or contentment. Confronted with a state of well-being, the mind gets antsy and nervous, and quickly comes up with a plan. Soon enough, we find ourselves with a new bone in our teeth, busy thinking about how we can protect what's going well from going bad or going away. We're thinking about what it'll be like when what's good is gone, how dreadfully bad that will be. From there, we can get thinking about all the things we need to do to keep this good thing going. It's a path without end, a bone that can splinter into an infinite number of baby bones. Great news for the mind, as it gets to stay fully engaged and employed. As we become more familiar with our thoughts, however, it's important that we do not demonize their presence. Thoughts are simply a part of the human experience. They cannot not exist. It's not their fault or our fault they're here. Even our negative thoughts, in their own misguided way, are an attempt to protect, defend, and guide us. While they may fail dreadfully at fulfilling this intention, and in fact end up working against us, we can still recognize that much of our thinking is motivated by a desire to make us feel better and keep us safe. Changing our relationship with thought, paradoxically, includes offering compassion to the very thing from which we must also separate and disengage. Chapter 3. What's Wrong with Me? Self-criticism and negativity. When it comes to negative thinking, we humans have an endless array of thinking styles to choose from, a plethora of stress-inducing thinking loops into which we can pour our attention. Amidst the abundance of negative thought options, however, we tend to skew towards certain favored flavors. Our number one favorite thinking loop is the one that specializes in, what's wrong with me? This kind of thinking is so popular, it has its own famous author, the inner critic. With this voice narrating in our heads, we spend vast amounts of time, more than the 10,000 hours supposedly required to master a sport or craft, thinking about our faults. We're experts at identifying and formulating the myriad ways we're broken, lacking, unlovable, guilty, to blame, and just plain not good enough. It's odd that we willingly spend so much time and energy thinking about what's wrong with ourselves, rehashing our failures, stoking our shame, and reliving the most awful moments of our life. How can this be our favorite choice for thinking? And yet we do, and it is. Peter, an intelligent, attractive young man with a great sense of humor, is forgiving and non-judgmental with other people. He saves up his anger and disapproval for himself. Highly self-critical, Peter relentlessly reminds himself, and me, his therapist, of his mistakes, of his inadequacies, and how he's not what everyone else thinks he is, unless they think he's bad, in which case he is what they think he is. In our society, self-criticism is the form of negative thinking that we suffer from the most. It is downright normal to beat ourselves up with our thoughts. If we don't do it, we're strange. Whole sections of bookstores are devoted to solving this kind of thinking. But the troves of advice don't seem to be solving the problem. The misguided protector. Odd though it may sound, at the inception of nearly every self-critical thought lies some form of positive intention, no matter how twisted, faulty, or outdated. Rarely have I found an exception to this rule. In Peter's case, when I asked him what he would risk were he to stop reminding himself of his failures, he said that his criticisms made him get things done, and without them, he'd get lazy. He was sure that if he stopped building a case for his flaws, he would forget them, get cocky, and start blindly acting them out. The positive intention within his negative thoughts was born out of his belief that his thoughts made him better and protected him from his inherent inadequacy. From this perspective, thoughts were there to help him. Identifying the beliefs behind your self-critical thoughts can be revolutionary. Once you can see the beliefs, you can unravel them, unearth their faulty nature, and thus strip them of their power. I asked Peter if he would test out his theory, namely, that attacking himself motivated him to accomplish more. When he returned a couple weeks later, he was smiling and told me that he had discovered something mind-boggling. He noticed that when he stopped reminding himself of everything he'd ever done wrong, he felt freer, lighter, and happier. Consequently, he was able to get more things done and be more productive. He said it felt like he had taken off a 10,000-pound coat. Rather than having to approach every new experience as a test to prove his self-critic wrong, a chance to not fail again, he had permission to do what he needed to do, to attend to the tasks in front of him, and no more. Peter's self-critical thoughts had convinced him that they were there to whip him into shape, that he needed whipping in order to function well. But what he discovered was that without them, he was filled with energy and good ideas, quite the opposite of what he had feared. When he stopped believing his negative thoughts, Peter's life became possible. He was free to function well in the present moment. He didn't need whipping after all. Have you ever given yourself a chance to find out whether your story is really true? Are you willing to give yourself that chance? Identify a specific criticism or judgment you hold against yourself. Ask yourself, what is the belief about me behind this self-critical thought? If I were to let go of this judgment, what do I fear would happen? Who or what am I afraid I would become without this thought? What story about myself is this thought supporting? From whom did I learn this story about me? Once you've unpacked the self-judgment, where you learned it, and what its purpose might have been, you can consider leaving that suitcase on the side of the road, or maybe handing it back to the person who packed it for you. Notice who you are without it. Right now is the time to forgive yourself for whatever crimes and mistakes you think that negative version of yourself committed. This is the moment to break the cycle. Release what you were taught to believe about you, what you thought kept you safe. Who do you want to be? Be that person, starting now. Disappointed so we don't get disappointed. Self-critical thoughts, in their own illogical way, are also an attempt to protect ourselves from negative feelings. We tell ourselves we won't get what we want, can't expect to get what we want, and shouldn't even bother trying, all in an effort to protect ourselves from feeling disappointed, ashamed, and inadequate if things don't go our way. We set ourselves up for defeat, so we're ready for defeat, should it come. Essentially, we force ourselves to pre-experience disappointment and self-loathing, to protect ourselves from disappointment and self-loathing. But telling ourselves we won't get what we want usually ends up preventing us from getting what we want. We've already taken ourselves out of the running, or, if not entirely out of it, we're carrying a heavy backpack of negative thoughts that weighs us down and makes it less likely we'll achieve our goal. The more we try to protect ourselves from feelings of failure, the more we ensure that we'll fail. By inserting our assumptions of disappointment and failure before reality has been written, we're conducting a mandatory dress rehearsal, compelling ourselves to preemptively run through the negative feelings. If it turns out that indeed we don't get what we want when the time comes, we'll then have to live the feelings a second time, for the real show. Will the real feelings sting any less because we got to feel and rehearse them ahead of time? No, they will not. By setting ourselves up for disaster in advance, all we end up accomplishing is an extra experience of suffering. Why make ourselves experience these negative feelings twice rather than once? Or maybe even not at all? Why not wait and see whether we need to experience disappointment or shame, even once? And if we do need to, why not live them when they're actually called for? Why not save the experience, whatever it may be, for when the feelings are real and not imagined? When we tell ourselves we're going to fail, what we're really doing is trying to control the anxiety of not knowing what will happen. Once we decide we're not going to succeed, we've solved the problem of the unknown. We've inserted a negative conclusion, and no longer have to live in what's unknowable and as yet unwritten. We're not going to get what we want. Case closed. Anxiety and uncertainty successfully avoided. We can thus understand the self-critic for what it's really up to, namely, trying to help us escape our desperate discomfort with uncertainty. The antidote to this self-destructive and self-discouraging thinking is to remind ourselves of the truth. We don't know what the future holds. We don't know whether we will or won't get what we want. Ask yourself, do I want or need more practice experiencing disappointment or shame? Am I willing to stay open to the uncertainty and acknowledge that I don't know what will happen? That uncertainty is the only real truth? Am I willing to accept that the story hasn't been written yet? Remember, you're writing the story of your life right now. As you think it, so you create it. Rather than generating a fictional failure, we must remind ourselves that we don't know, and indeed, no one knows what will happen in the future. What is helpful in the face of the unknown, in the unwritten story, is to show up with grace. Try our very best. Be the person we want to be, and have the courage to live directly in the discomfort. We can live in the not knowing without imaginary answers. Maintaining a status quo. In other instances, our self-critical thoughts are sneakily designed to protect and maintain a certain status quo. When I met Melanie, she was an actress with a powerful but slippery inner critic, who was forever telling her that she was just a mediocre performer. When she had a chance to land big roles, this critic would open fire with a deluge of thoughts, reminding her that she was not one of the special people. Not someone who was ever going to be a star. This voice whispered that she was the dependably average one, a hard worker, but not a real player. Always there in the shadows, the thoughts were poised to pounce on any opportunity that could lead to a change in who she thought she was. It was clear, however, that her inner critic's story simply didn't match her personality, her talent, or the response she was receiving from the rest of the world. Cleverly, Melanie's thoughts didn't accuse her of being untalented. Their story on her was more nuanced, and to some degree more insidious. Not the kind of inner critic you immediately recognize as damaging. As I got to know Melanie, I simultaneously, through her accounts, got to know her mother, also a performer, who demanded a lot of attention, and was always the brightest light in the room. I asked Melanie what a relationship with her mother might be like if she, Mel, became a special person, famous or successful. She shook her head, let out a big "ha," and said, not sure she'd be up for that challenge. Supporting actress to her daughter, no less. After a bit, she got more serious and sad, adding that she just couldn't imagine that happening. There was no room for another star in the family. Melanie's thoughts had found a way to protect her from having to live that unimaginable scenario. As devoted as her mother, on the surface, was to supporting her daughter's career, it was evident that Melanie's success would have gravely threatened her mother's role, which, consequently, would have threatened her mother's ability to be supportive and loving. Mel knew that either she got to have a mother or she got to have a career, but not both. Her thoughts supported her choice for a mother and ensured that Melanie would get what she needed most. Our negative thoughts, as hurtful and destructive as they can be, may also contain profound intelligence. It's usually an intelligence born out of a younger and less psychologically well-developed incarnation of ourselves, a coping mechanism that was necessary at a time when we had less awareness, insight, and resources. Ask yourself, what early experiences or family dynamics inform my self-thoughts? Are they helping me maintain the status quo, maintain the same me? Do I still need these thoughts, working behind the scenes on my behalf? Do I still want this reality? What matters is that we become aware of the deeper beliefs our thoughts are operating from, and consider whether such thoughts are still acting in our best interest. Once the roots of our thoughts are unearthed, our choices and actions become clearer and easier. The negative caretaker inside. Sometimes our self-attacking thoughts are simply a matter of repeating to ourselves what we heard from our caretakers growing up. Having internalized our caretakers' negative versions of us, we continue to talk and think about ourselves in the ways we learned were appropriate and deserved. If, from an early age, we were taught to believe that we deserve blame and criticism and aren't worthy of kindness, then that's what we tell ourselves and how we treat ourselves. By internalizing our negative caretakers, repeating their words and sentiments, we keep an active relationship at play with those caretakers. We are saved from having to examine the choices and behaviors of those people who taught us to believe such negative thoughts about ourselves. In so doing, we keep our caretakers good and us to blame, because the idea of our caretakers, the people who are supposed to love us, being wrong or profoundly flawed is too painful and discordant to accept. We adopt their version of who we are, so we don't have to recognize that their words and actions may have been unwarranted, unkind, unsupportive, untrue, or not what was needed to thrive, even if they were doing the best they could. We are saved from having to confront the possibility that those who we needed to love us were not always loving. Taking on the negative voices of our early influencers, we ensure that we'll never have to experience the unfairness, the tragedy, at the very root of our own negative thoughts. Exercise. A compassionate tone. No matter what you think is true about yourself, no matter what you've been taught to believe, take a moment to feel what it's like to go through life with this story about you. 1. Place a hand on your heart and imagine yourself at the age when you started believing these negative thoughts about yourself. 2. The practice is not to consider whether you deserve the criticism, to validate or invalidate it, but to simply feel what it's been like to continue this kind of relationship with yourself. What has it been like? 3. Imagine that you're speaking to that child. You. What would you want to say? What would that child have wanted to hear? What words or actions would have really helped at that point in time? 4. What words or actions will help you now? The goal here is to cultivate kindness for yourself, for the self that was and is being judged and criticized, the self who, even worse, was taught that it deserves it, that you deserve it. Even if you still think you deserve the negative thoughts, if you can feel a hint of kindness for yourself, simply for having to live with the belief that you are bad, not enough, or broken, then you're steadfastly on your way to a new relationship with your self-critical thoughts. When such thoughts arise, rather than identifying with the attacker and jumping on board, you can shift your identification from the one who's doing the attacking to the one who's taking the beating. From this new perspective, it is obvious that self-attacking thoughts are no longer welcome and can no longer be tolerated. Is it true? When you listen closely to your self-critical thoughts and tune in to what they're actually saying to you, you'll likely notice that a lot of it is simply false. It doesn't match up with what you say and do, how you behave, and ultimately who you are, even by your own estimation. Most of us would disagree with some of what we habitually tell ourselves about ourselves. If you think that everything your critical and judging inner voice says is absolutely true and irrefutable, then inquire as to whether anything else is also true. If negative thoughts are telling you that you're selfish and self-centered, ask whether you are also, some of the time, generous and giving. Perhaps you can remember a time when you were not selfish or self-centered. When we're caught in a thought loop, we're operating in a good or bad system. But the truth is, we're all good and bad, lovely and not, contradictions at play. In a word, human. So expand your vision to include more of yourself, a more realistic and, dare I say, forgiving view. The whole picture, not just one tiny piece or moment of it. You can, essentially, pull the lens out and away from where you're fixated. As a human being, you're inherently and inescapably imperfect. When identified with self-critical thoughts, you've revoked your right to be who you fundamentally are, have condemned your basic nature, and are sparring with an unconquerable and disinterested opponent called reality. Whether you're willing to admit it or not, you are a work in progress, doing the best you can, even when it might not be your best on another day or the best you can imagine in your head. Whatever you do is your best at that moment, because it is what you did, or said, or were, despite everything else you knew and could have done. Even if you were aware of another choice, a better choice, or if deep down you knew it was a bad choice, you chose what you chose. This confirms, without exception, that you were not ready or able to make that other, wiser known choice. You didn't have it in your wheelhouse just yet. Our best is not what we think or know is best, but what we have the ability and power to carry out. Our best in any moment is determined by what we actually do, not what we know or think. As flawed creatures, we sometimes act in ways that don't represent who we want to be and can be. When we make a mistake, miss the mark in some way, what matters is that we identify and unpack the mistake itself. We investigate what led to it, what thoughts and beliefs created it, and most importantly, what is to be learned from it. We acknowledge the mistake, take responsibility for our part, make amends if necessary, and drop it. Let me repeat that. We acknowledge the mistake, own it, make amends if necessary, and drop it. We let the mistake be what it was, and no more. Don't add a storyline to it, or expand it to become a testimony of your self-worth, proof of why you're bad. Mistakes need not be character assassins. Mistakes can simply be opportunities for you to become more self-aware, to keep progressing as the work in progress that you are. They can simply be mistakes, and ultimately, teachers. The fact that you fall short doesn't mean you're bad. It just confirms that you're imperfect, which hopefully you already know. Even though there's no other way we can be, we still refuse to forgive ourselves for our basic nature. To recover from self-critical thinking, hammer home to yourself regularly that your goal in life is progress, not perfection. The important thing is not that you've missed the mark. That's merely a blip on the screen, your starting place, but rather what you do with that truth, how you change and evolve, how courageous you are in your forward movement. It comes down to being more mindful and self-aware, which we'll cultivate throughout this book. Every moment we spend lamenting our missteps is another moment of life we've effectively thrown away, another opportunity we've squandered, when we could have been behaving in a different way, being and becoming the self we want to be. What would they say? When we're inside the hornet's nest, getting stung by self-critical thoughts, we can invite a friend into the nest with us. That is, we can imagine what someone who loves us, a friend or trusted teacher, might tell us in that moment. Sometimes the kindness or fairness that it requires to break out of a self-critical loop can only come through inviting in another person's experience of us, seeing ourselves through another set of eyes. Exercise. Invite a kind voice. At the moment you're hooked. You may not have access to a loving or realistic view of yourself. So, imagine what a respected other would say to or about you, and, no matter how ridiculous or seemingly untrue, force yourself to hear it. The act of unhooking from your own thoughts and inviting in this more balanced and compassionate version of yourself can change the internal weather and reroute your self-critical loop. 1. Place a hand on your heart. Take a deep breath. Tune in to your own felt experience. 2. Now call to mind someone who loves you, from any period in your life, alive or dead. Someone who makes you feel cared about, whom you trust wants the best for you, wants you to be happy. Invite the kindness and love they feel for you into your own heart. Imagine soaking your inner critic's words in this kindness. 3. Say to yourself inside, may I experience kindness. May I feel loved. May I be happy. Repeat these words out loud if you can. Write them down. Put a list of them in your pocket and carry them with you. This way, you can learn a new way of relating with yourself. We don't come into this life with self-hating thoughts. We learn them. We're taught them. When you catch yourself joining forces with the self-critic, you can stop and acknowledge that you are now the one doing to yourself what was done to you. You are now the one making the choice to perpetuate this self-inflicted unkindness. You can also remember that this self-attack is positively not organic or natural. You don't have to do it. There is no reason to do it. Awakening to the tragedy of this learned, self-critical relationship with ourselves is the real path to releasing the self-critic. Once we actually care about ourselves, and our heart breaks for our own suffering, we can't beat ourselves up in the same way. It's just not possible. Compassion for our own experience is the true antidote to self-harming thoughts. Chapter 4. What's wrong with everyone else? Grievance, resentment, and blame. If we took a random snapshot of our attention at any given moment on any given day, there's a strong chance we'd find it comfortably entrenched in thoughts of how to control and change the people, places, and things in our personal world. We love to ruminate on the people, places, and things responsible for our life not being the way we want it to be, the way it should be. We delight in rehashing all that's to blame for our discontent. It's a negative thinking loop that rages against grievance and assigns blame. In a word, it is our complaints. This particular flavor of negative thinking was my personal favorite. When I relapse, it's still my flavor of choice. I spent more time than I'd like to acknowledge rehashing the situations and people I was most bothered by. How certain people were blocking me from being happy, and what I needed to do about it. How I was going to fix it. I argued many cases in the courtroom of my own mind, proving why my frustration, anger, and discontent were justified, why it all made sense. I missed a lot of present moments, lost in this tsunami of what I didn't like and what I was going to do to change it while life was passing me by. Railing at others harms us most. Each time a situation arises that we don't like or agree with, we are convinced that this is the situation. This issue is at the core of our suffering. If we could solve and control this one, get the other person to understand and change what they were doing wrong in this situation, then we would be happy and free. Then we would be done with having to control and fix our situation. Then we would be okay. Unfortunately, every grievance is the one, and we wouldn't dare let go of any of them. We never get to the bottom of the pile. The time never actually comes when we can stop trying to control and fix our situation. When we're trapped inside a blaming loop, we're shoring up our convictions about what's causing our suffering, solidifying our rightness and the other's wrongness, essentially creating our own hell. With all our righteous rightness, we succeed only at building ourselves a cage of anger, dissatisfaction, and victimhood, in which we then have to live. We've proven our airtight case against the other, but at the expense of our own well-being. The other person, situation, or institution may be wrong as we see it, but we're the ones suffering, no matter who's to blame. We keep lighting ourselves on fire, hoping the other will die of smoke inhalation. An endless search for pain relief. So, what are we trying to accomplish with all this self-inflicted suffering? Is there a positive intention anywhere in this painful process? Yes. Obsessively rehashing our grievances is a primitive and flawed attempt to make ourselves feel better. In relentlessly thinking and talking about who and what that we didn't like, we're trying to understand what happened and get it into a narrative that feels manageable. Through our replays, we're trying to transform a negative situation into something acceptable, trying to get okay with what doesn't feel okay. Our complaining thoughts are simultaneously an attempt to empower ourselves. We feel aggrieved, mistreated, or bad, and so we puff up our chest with our righteous indignation and chime on about how wrongly we're being treated. It's a way of proving to ourselves and whoever will listen that we're deserving of better treatment. We matter and should not be treated this way. We keep thinking about it until we prove it to ourselves, which sometimes never happens. When we're feeling small and life feels unfair, we focus on who's to blame, how we're right and they're wrong, all in an attempt to feel less victimized, bigger, and better. Ruminating on what's causing our unhappiness is an attempt to contain and compartmentalize what hurts. If we can get the right conceptual packaging around our hurt and anger, we'll be able to get it into a tidy box, put it on the shelf, and keep it there. If we can understand and explain what's making us feel bad and why, the hope is it might not feel so bad. When we're busy griping to ourselves, we believe that somewhere in this rabbit hole of complaints, maybe way down at the bottom of it, we'll find the relief we desperately crave. But the more we scratch, the itchier and bloodier it gets. The deeper down the rabbit hole we plunge, searching for relief, the farther away we get from it. In some elementary way, we're wired to obsess over what's bothering us because, as the spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle suggests, we associate complaining with getting what we want. As children, if we throw a temper tantrum, it will often lead to a change in the situation we're railing against. If we complain loud or long enough, we can usually wear our parents down so we get what we want. As adults, we operate within this same framework. If we whine enough about our situation, eventually the situation will change. Someone, somewhere, maybe the universe or God, or the other person involved, will do something to make it better for us, as it happened in the past. But because it's no longer our parents we're fighting with, who presumably care about our unhappiness, or at least don't want to have to listen to it, because it's now reality we're pleading with, a reality that isn't interested in our complaints and can't be worn down, we're fresh out of luck. Our endless complaints remain within us, against us, and against reality, useless when it comes to improving our situation. Rehashing our grievances is an attempt to get our suffering heard and understood. By obsessively revisiting what feels unfair, we're providing ourselves with an undivided and unconditional audience for our complaints, something we don't often receive from those we believe should care. In serving as an ear for our own suffering, we're offering ourselves validation, concern, affirmation, and ultimately love. Our grievances are grieved within the presence we desperately crave, one that never grows tired of our upset. Yet, despite the positive intentions behind our incessant self-complaining, we benefit more when we take a good look at whether it is accomplishing our goals. Ask yourself, is it true that I feel more validated as a result of thinking about what hurts? Is it true that I feel more empowered from thinking about what's unfair? Does thinking about my discontent free me from my discontent? Do my angry thoughts transform my anger into something more peaceful? If you're like most people, the answer is a clear no, all around. Fighting reality internally doesn't change it. Like the Greek god Sisyphus, who is condemned for eternity to roll a giant rock up a steep hill only to have it roll back down each time he neared the top, we mortals chase after a life in which everything is exactly the way we want it to be. But like Sisyphus, we never actually get to the top of that mountain, or create that life in which we agree with, or are pleased with, everything and everyone. As soon as we are pleased with one thing, another thing falls apart, and so life goes. The bad news is that life will always continue being life, with its joys and sorrows, irritations and satisfactions. The good news is that when we change our mind, change our relationship with our thoughts, how we experience life's lifeness also changes. Furthermore, when our attention is focused outward at what we think is making us miserable, we're perpetuating an unhealthy dependence on external circumstances. The belief that our well-being is at the mercy of our situation leaves us powerless and frustrated, in a constant state of fragility, because we can never control our external reality. Convincing ourselves that the rest of the world is forever the cause of our internal agitation leaves us desperately trying to control everyone and everything, to orchestrate a life that always goes our way. In other words, a life that doesn't exist. As long as we're focusing on what's wrong with our external world, we're perpetuating our own misery. There's only one thing I know that's true 100% of the time. When we fight with reality, reality wins. We use our grievances as weapons to fight with reality. True to form, reality wins, always, which means we lose. Freedom from your grievance-focused thinking becomes possible when you discover that your internal fight with reality has not and is not going to change it. When you stop living in a state of aggression with the way things are, bracing against what is, you discover acceptance and a different level of peace. It doesn't mean that you should stop trying to change life when it's not to your liking. But it does mean that you choose to stop fighting against the fact that life is the way it is right now. This is reality, like it or not. Whatever is bothering you on the outside, no matter how juicy a problem, is really a doorway into something threatening you on the inside. We change our relationship with our thoughts when we turn our attention away from what our thoughts are talking about, who and what we resent, and turn toward ourselves and our experience. The idea here is not to shift from blaming someone or something else to blaming yourself, but rather to use your aggrieved thoughts as opportunities to get in touch with your own feelings and fears, and deepen your understanding of the real problem. Once you accept that your suffering is not actually caused by the newest object of your discontent, you're less likely to feel victimized by life situations and less inclined to suffer. When you stop believing the thoughts that are telling you the other is the problem, the other is what's making you miserable, the other needs to change for you to be okay, then the other becomes less problematic. When a complaint or resentment next appears, turn your attention away from the object of your disapproval, from what you think is causing your unhappiness. Look within. Ask yourself, what feelings, hurts, or fears is this situation or person triggering in me? Does this situation put me in touch with humiliation, inadequacy, loss? Does it make me feel unloved, unseen, unimportant? Or how? What does this feeling remind me of? We don't experience suffering. Rather, we suffer our experience. Our situation is not what causes us to suffer. What I'm suggesting here is not meant to minimize the brutality of what we sometimes have to live through. Our situations can be monstrously challenging. I've walked through situations that were so painful I wasn't sure I could get through them. And likewise, I've accompanied others through such circumstances. More than anything else, what determines whether or not we consistently suffer, whether or not we're okay, is the way we interact with our life situations, which ultimately reflects the relationship we create with our own experience. Your grievances are your teachers, here to show you what your real suffering is about, and where your real freedom can be found. Contentment becomes possible when you give yourself permission to stop focusing and fixating on who and what stands in the way of it, and get on with the business of creating contentment no matter what anyone or anything else is up to. By paying attention to your own side of the street, as opposed to cleaning up all the other streets in the neighborhood, you will discover that you can be content in a life that includes things you don't like and wish were different. Stop thinking so much about the problem, taking everyone else's inventory, diagnosing and repairing the cause of your discontent, and instead, turn your focus to your own responses and attitude. Attend to who you want to be in a world that will always be not entirely to your liking. Then you can create a good life without changing anyone or anything. Challenges then become opportunities to do something different, be somebody different within it, and stretch beyond your habitual patterns. You can even learn to look forward to problematic situations and people as opportunities to practice being who you want to be, your best self. When you turn the lens back on yourself, you reclaim your power. You regain the right and dignity to choose what your participation in life will be. Failing our way to freedom. What starts us on the path to freedom is failure. Very little of the obsessive thinking, rehashing, ruminating, rehearsing, proving, scripting, controlling, and mock dialoguing that goes on inside our echo chambers actually makes much of anything better in the relationships or situations we're obsessing about. Almost none of it creates real change. In fact, our ruminating makes relationships worse, as we are more entrenched in what we perceive as wrong, and thus less present and available to what is actually happening. What do we accomplish through all the hours and days spent thinking about what bothers us? Making ourselves even more bothered, We fail ourselves first. Despite believing at some level that you are helping yourself by searching for solutions to your problems, nonetheless, you're likely also exhausted, bored with your own thoughts, and sick and tired of feeling the way you feel. It's only when you can't stand to keep doing what you are doing, can't take listening to the same storylines, that you'll make a commitment to yourself. As soon as you notice an old or new grievance arising, promise yourself you'll deliberately do something different. Exercise. Moments of choice. The next time you're about to dive into the mud with your thoughts, pause for a moment and make a different choice. Follow these steps. 1. Acknowledge the muddy thoughts themselves. Do not get involved in their content, but consciously note that the complaints are here. 2. Remind yourself that if you follow these thoughts, go for the ride they're offering, you will suffer. This is certain. 3. No matter how compelling and believable the negative thoughts may feel, choose to say no, to refuse their invitation. Say the words out loud. I will not do this, will not feed this story with my attention. 4. Take a deep breath. Check in with your senses. Corral your attention into the place where your feet are planted. 5. Do this over and over and over again. It's crucial to initiate this practice as soon as you first detect the rumblings of negativity, to catch the thoughts at the gate before they gather strength. The longer your thoughts rumble and make their case, the more likely they will hook you in. And then, once again, you will need to claw yourself out of the rabbit hole. So start this process early. Be consistent and be fierce. Through this simple but radical practice, we discover something deliciously surprising. That is, when we consistently turn away from the negative thoughts and stories in our head, we actually feel freer and happier. So, too, we feel guided by a greater source of wisdom and even love. Just the act of making this simple choice for ourselves, for our own well-being, feels like a moment of grace. In the process, we stumble into the realization that we can change our life by choosing how we relate to our thoughts. We, all of us, can create the kind of inner environment in which we want to live. You have the capacity to take this step and make this profound choice. It may not be your first or most intuitive choice to turn away from the negative thoughts that feel so enticing and seductive, as if they'll fix the problem. To stop feeding your unhappiness takes awareness, conviction, and a desire to stop making yourself suffer. Let me repeat that. To stop making yourself suffer. It takes courage to step into the unknown. Try something you don't yet know will work, and reject what your mind is saying you should think about. The process of turning away and turning towards something different is about your willingness to change. If for no other reason, then you're not willing to stay the same. Wake up to your freedom. This is a process of waking up and seeing, clearly, that you are the one making yourself unhappy. The toxins you are ingesting are your own thoughts. The present moment is usually okay, but you are actively injecting it with discontent. Understanding this truth fully and irreconcilably gives you no choice but to stop doing what you have been doing to your now and to yourself. Waking up to the failure of obsessive thinking as a path to happiness sets us free. Somewhere deep inside, barely in the realm of the conscious, we believe that letting go of our grievances is tantamount to abandoning our suffering. We believe that we need to directly attend to the contents of our unhappiness, get into the particulars, and solve them. We think that thinking is the only way to find a solution and thereby relieve our suffering. We are wrong. Realizing that more thinking would not and will not solve our problems, we let go and offer ourselves a different experience of life. Ultimately, we stop trying to control and change what isn't ours to control or change. Turning away from suffering, in reality, is an act of profound kindness for ourselves. What we think of as emotional self-neglect, the deprivation of our own empathy, turns out to be just the opposite, an expression of self-love. Hiding in the most unlikely, counterintuitive place lies the solution to our self-inflicted suffering. Not a solution to the particular problem at hand, the situation we think needs fixing, but a solution for a new way of experiencing life. All this time, what we needed to change our reality was to come back to the reality that was already here. The present moment has been waiting for us all this time, but we have to fail long and hard enough to be able to see it. Exercise. Taking a break. Choose a problem that you're currently wrestling with. Not a traumatic problem, but something that's bothering you. 1. For the purpose of this exercise, give yourself permission to stop trying to figure it out. Tell yourself, just for now, I don't have to solve this. Don't have to devise a next right step. In this moment, give yourself a break from all fixing. 2. Allow yourself to rest in this parenthesis of relief. 3. Notice what it feels like to be off-duty from solving the problem. 4. Notice, too, that this problem-free space was created entirely by you, and not by any change in the problem itself. As a practice, refusing the invitation to descend into the rabbit hole of negativity can feel ridiculously simple and easy. Too simple and easy to be an answer. The mind prefers and trusts complexity. The mind and complexity are natural bedfellows. But the experience and wisdom, born of suffering, that it takes to be able to implement this practice is anything but simple or easy. After the countless hours I spent thinking about how to fix and solve my grievances, here's what I figured out. And I hope this exercise helps you reach the same conclusion. I can't, we can't, feel good with more control or more thinking. I give you permission, and the strong suggestion, to turn away from the contents of your discontent and rejoin your life, to be where your feet are right now. You're not copping out, bypassing your problems, living in denial, taking the easy path, or abandoning or neglecting yourself. You're actually choosing the path of wisdom and self-compassion when you stop perpetuating a self-generated hell on earth, the one inside your own mind, and choose to be free. When we stop. A miraculous thing happens, too, when we stop obsessively trying to think our way out of problems. Our problems tend to become less problematic. And even more amazingly, solutions that we could never have thought up start to appear. When we're deep down the rabbit hole, we can't believe that something other than our own minds can get us out. We trust only our thinking, as we've been taught. But when we really get it, get that thinking won't take us to freedom, when we finally surrender and accept that we can't mentally muscle our way out of suffering, something else shows up and shows us another way, a way we never could have thought up. But here's the thing. You can't do it. You can only stop trying to figure it out, turn it over, and get out of the way. Exercise. Recall your motivation. Offer yourself a simple mantra, which is a saying that is helpful and beneficial to repeat often. You can say it to yourself inside or out loud, once a day, or 500 times a day. It goes like this: I don't want to suffer. I want to be happy. I want to know peace. I want to be free. You can change the words around to make it fit just right, shorten it or lengthen it. But no matter the words, say it and do it. This is a wish for your own well-being, for the end of your suffering. It's a gift that changes your relationship with yourself, and thus your relationship with everything, including your thoughts. Remember, you're doing something radical and new. You are literally resetting your mind's wiring, building new mental habits and pathways in your brain. It takes effort and conviction to rewire the mind. It will not feel natural at first. Your mind will want to pull you back and will come up with all sorts of enticing reasons why you must continue ruminating on your problems. Negative thinking is what the mind has always done. But persevere. Hang on tightly to your no. Remind yourself of where you end up, every time, when you follow your negative thoughts. Imagine your grievances as Post-it notes, prompting you to come home to your senses, to drop your awareness out of your head and into your body. Remember that you don't want to suffer. Remember, you want to be happy.